The PS4 Pro is now 3 years old, and in that time we've seen a lot of games take advantage of its more powerful hardware, but which stand above the rest in 2019. Today I'll be running through the 14 best for the PS4 Pro, taking into consideration factors such as performance increases, visual enhancements, and whether the game gives you options such as favouring resolution or favouring frame rate. Before I jump in, it's worth noting that to get the most from your PS4 Pro, you will need a 4K TV, but not just any 4K TV, it will need to be one with a wide enough colour gamut and true 10-bit HDR. Also, with the PS5 launching at the tail end of next year, if you want to make sure you are future-proofed, you'll want one that supports HDMI 2.1 as it may make use of it. With all that said, if you don't have a 4K TV, you'll still reap some of the benefits of the Pro thanks to downsampling and boost mode. To kick it off, we're going to talk about one of the first games that really stood out on the PS4 Pro, infamous Second Son. While it's a few years old now, it still looks great, running at a checkerboarded 1800p that really brings Seattle to life and makes a huge difference in clarity. It also features a performance mode that retains the original 1080p resolution but offers a frame rate that sticks pretty close to 60 FPS, unlike in resolution mode that sits closer to 40 FPS. HDR is a feature and is one of the most standout examples of it, with Delson's powers, especially Neon, looking incredible. It's also worth mentioning that infamous First Light, a standalone DLC entry, receives the same benefits on the Pro as Second Son and is definitely worth checking out. Next up is Uncharted 4. Uncharted 4, even on a base PS4, is no question one of the best looking games of this generation, and its Pro enhancement further emphasises that. Although it doesn't run at as high of a resolution as many others on this list, coming in at 1440p, thanks to great temporal anti-aliasing and artistic direction, it holds up just as well as the others, if not better. HDR is supported, making one of the most visually standout games even more impressive. Naughty Dog have since released a standalone DLC, The Lost Legacy, which has the same benefits as 4, so it's another great example. The third entry is Final Fantasy 15, which was my first experience on the Pro, as well as a 4K TV, and 3 years later it still holds up pretty well. Final Fantasy 15 features HDR support as well as 3 modes for the PS4 Pro, High, Light and Steady. In High mode, the resolution is bumped up to 1800p via checkerboarding, in addition to other visual enhancements. The Light and Steady modes are similar in that they both operate at 1080p, but the key difference between them is that Light runs at an uncapped frame rate, while Steady caps it to 30. Which you prefer will ultimately come down to personal preference, but having options is never a bad thing. Moving on to a slightly newer game, we have 2018's Shadow of the Colossus, a remake from the ground up by the talented team Bluepoint Games. On the Pro you have two options, Cinematic and Performance mode. Cinematic pushes the resolution up to 1440p at 30 FPS, really drawing your attention to the strikingly desolate world and towering Colossus you'll hunt down. Performance mode on the other hand keeps to 1080p but hikes the frame rate right up to an almost solid 60 FPS, keeping motion extremely fluid. So whether you prefer the extra visual fidelity or the stronger performance, you have two great options that succeed very well in achieving what they set out to do, and it's an excellent purchase for any Pro owner. Next up we have another cinematic and incredible looking game, Quantic Dream's Detroit Become Human. Detroit runs at a checkerboarded 4K, although it's worth noting that many of its effects are rendered at a lower resolution to aid performance. In terms of the performance itself, when played on the Pro, you get a more stable 30 FPS than on a standard PS4. Dips can be seen on either model, but the Pro drops less frames less often, making for a smoother experience. The Pro enhancements aren't hugely obvious, but the resolution bump and great HDR alongside the more consistent frame rate help to really pronounce how technically impressive the game is overall. In last year's video I featured Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but when I recently went back and compared that entry to the previous one, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Rise actually edges it out on visuals. What's great about the game is that it supports 3 different modes: resolution, high frame rate and enriched visuals. In resolution mode it runs at 4K checkerboard at 30 FPS and is one of the better games to utilise the checkerboarding method, showing how close to a native 4K it can look. High frame rate keeps the resolution at 1080p but uncaps the frame rate, hitting 60 FPS at max and dropping to the mid-40s during more intense moments. Alternatively, enriched visuals keeps the resolution at 1080p and the FPS to 30, but adds elements like pure hair tech, better texture filtering, more realistic reflections, and more dynamic foliage. From a Tomb Raider to a Spartan, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Odyssey builds upon all that Origins introduced into the series with a map over 60% bigger. The game has a variable resolution ranging from 1242p up to 1584p, which is significantly lower than when running on the Xbox One X, but still produces a breathtaking result, showing off the vast detailed world much clearer, and is still a pretty big leap over the base PS4, which can even fall below 1080p with noticeable blur. Framerate is also noticeably more stable, only dropping a frame or two here and there, as opposed to the base model, which drops to the mid-20s and more frequently. Once again, you have HDR support, making fire effects in particular really stand out. Next up is a WIPEOUT Omega Collection. With motion blur enabled, the game runs at a checkerboarded 4K. However, if you turn off motion blur, you get an impressive native 4K image, which looks awesome in motion. Regardless of which you use, it will run at a rock solid 60 FPS, which for a racing game of this type is much appreciated. To top all off, there is some pretty decent HDR support, which in addition to the native 4K option, ultimately results in a really standout title that really takes advantage of the hardware like few others. Number 9 is Insomniac's Ratchet & Clank, a brilliant example of how you don't need to go for realism to produce stunning visuals. On the Pro, Ratchet & Clank uses a unique method called temporal injection to reach 2160p, and the end result is something that really doesn't fall short of a Pixar movie. In fact, if you showed it to a family member, they'd probably assume it was one. Combine that with some genuinely good HDR, and Ratchet & Clank isn't just a damn good remake of the 2002 original, but a visual showcase that's bursting with colour and charm. The following entry is another by Insomniac, and it's their biggest selling game to date, Spider-Man. As you'd expect, Insomniac have used the same temporal injection technique as Ratchet & Clank, with Spider-Man sitting at a resolution of 1584p on average, with the framerate locked to 30 FPS the majority of the time. Even though the resolution is lower than their previous game, that's not surprising considering that Spider-Man is an open world title with much more to load on screen at once. That said, Spider-Man is another example of a fantastic game for the Pro, and as cliche as it sounds, really does bring the web slinger to life like no previous game has come even close to. Just like Ratchet & Clank, there is the inclusion of solid HDR that adds some great vibrancy to the image. Here we have the second racing game on this list, and it's another impressive one, Gran Turismo Sport. When on the Pro and high resolution mode, it outputs at 1800p checkerboarded and produces an image that looks scarily close to photorealism. It runs mostly at a locked 60 FPS, with only the rare inconsequential drops you'll be hard pressed to notice. The HDR implementation is easily one of the best on this list. In fact, it's the first game to accurately represent the iconic Ferrari red when HDR is enabled. When you choose to output in 1080p, you have two modes, prioritize framerate and prioritize quality. And one of the benefits of running in 1080p is the ability to watch replays back in 60 FPS as opposed to 30 like on the standard PS4 or while on high resolution mode on the Pro. Number 12 is God of War, a game that made some daring changes to the long-running series that really paid off, from its storytelling to its characters, gameplay and world. God of War is another of the many games to make use of the checkerboarding method to achieve 4K, but is one of the best to utilise the method, leaving minimal artifacts, giving an image that looks close to a native 4K. Take that into account with some great HDR, and God of War is one of the most visually striking games on the platform, with jaw-dropping fight sequences and unbelievably detailed environments that truly brings Norse mythology to life. As with many of the previous entries, there is a performance mode that retains the standard 1080p resolution, but uncaps the frame rate, generally sitting around the mid-40s. The next entry is a very recent and pretty divisive Death Stranding. Like God of War, we have another example of checkerboarding to reach 2160p, and the result is nothing short of fantastic, making even the desolate, empty world look impressive, with every small pebble and rock look crisp and clear. Even though there is no in-game option, if you do play on a 1080p set, it essentially puts the game into a performance mode, reducing any and all frame drops. Death Stranding may not be a game for everyone, but is no doubt one of the best looking on the console, taking advantage of all it has to offer and making the most out of the Decima engine. Speaking of the Decima engine, that leaves us with the last entry by Guerrilla Games, who actually made the engine itself, using it to create what I still think is the best game on the console, Horizon Zero Dawn. you have two modes to take advantage of. In resolution mode it sits at a checkerboarded 4K, and while not a native 4K, it's a perfect example of how close the checkerboarding method can appear to a native resolution, providing a clear, sharp image. Horizon also has fantastic HDR implementation, a true night and day difference that, provided you have a good 4K TV, is something that once you experience it, it's incredibly hard to go back from. In addition, Horizon does have a performance mode. Here the game runs at 1080p but holds a more locked 30 FPS, eliminating any drop. It's not a massive benefit though, so personally I recommend you stick with resolution mode and soak up just how drool dropping it can look. Before I round off this video, here are a few more games to check out that I didn't get the chance to talk about in detail. These are The Witcher 3, The Last of Us Remastered, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and Hitman 2. That's it for today. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for a notification each time a video goes live. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.